I've been reading Chicago novels for over 40 years. I first read Native Son and Sister Carrie back in the 1980s. I discovered the jungle in the 90s. I read The Adventures of Augie March in 2009. I discovered The Man with the Golden Arm more recently. And there's one great Chicago novel, Leon Forrest, Divine Days, that defeated me the first time I tried it. I've visited Chicago before, but this is the first time I've come here with these books so firmly in my mind. Standing here, looking out over this remarkable city, I'm realizing something. These novels didn't simply happen to take place in Chicago. Together, they tell the story of the city itself. I'm not here to tell lifelong Chicagoans about their city. I'm here as a reader who spent more than 40 years getting to know Chicago through its literature. And now I'm seeing the city through these books in a way I never have before. So today, let's talk about 6 of the greatest novels ever written about Chicago. Hello, welcome to my channel, Another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg. Today I'm filming from the terrace of a condominium overlooking Lincoln Park. I'm only here for a few days, but whenever I travel, my thoughts almost always turn to books. I start wondering, what did the great writers see here? How do they describe this place? And how does seeing it for myself change the way I think about their novels? When most people think about the great literary cities, New York usually comes first. Then maybe Paris, London, or Dublin. I'd argue Chicago belongs in that conversation. Chicago is a surprisingly young city. It was incorporated in 1837. Then came the Great Fire of 1871. Out of that disaster grew one of the great industrial cities of the world. Immigrants arrived from Europe. Migrants came north from American South. Factory workers, businessmen, reformers, politicians, gangsters, dreamers. Few American cities change so quickly, and that gave writers an endless supply of stories. Chicago literature develops its own personality. While New York novels often explored wealth, high society, and ambition, Chicago writers tended to focus on working people, immigrants, factories, labor, race, political corruption, the promise and sometimes the failure of the American dream. That's one of the reasons I love reading books set here. Each author discovers a different Chicago. Today, I want to introduce 6 novels that, in my opinion, belong among the greatest ever written about this city. Along the way, I'll mention a few others that deserve your attention as well. And I should probably confess something before we begin. I haven't finished all 6. Years before I joined BookTube, I made it about 200 pages into Leon Forrest's Divine Days before I realized I simply wasn't ready for it. That doesn't mean it isn't a great novel. It means I wasn't ready for the journey. After reading Joyce, Faulkner, Pynchon, and Gaddis, I think it's time to go back. We'll save that one for the end, because I have a feeling it's going to become one of the most important books still waiting for me. But let's begin at the beginning. The year is 1900. Chicago is exploding with growth, and a young woman named Carrie Meeber steps off a train looking for a better life. That brings us to Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie. The first novel on my list is Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. It was published in 1900, and in many ways it marks the beginning of modern Chicago fiction. Carrie Meeber leaves rural Wisconsin and comes to Chicago, hoping for a better life. What follows is the story of ambition, desire, poverty, luck, and social mobility. Modern readers may be surprised by how contemporary the novel feels. Dreiser refuses to divide his characters into heroes and villains. Instead, he asks the question that's still relevant today. How many of our lives are shaped by our choices, and how much by circumstance? Chicago almost becomes another character. It's full of opportunity, but it doesn't really care whether Carrie succeeds or fails. I first read Sister Carrie in the late 1980s with a book group made up of employees from Crown Books, a bookstore chain that's now long gone. Honestly, I don't remember every detail of the plot. What I remember is my reaction. People talked about how shocking the novel had been when it was first published. As a reader in the 1980s, I remember thinking, really? By modern standards, it didn't seem shocking at all. But that says more about how society changed during the 20th century than it does about Dreiser. At the turn of the century, Carrie's choices challenged accepted ideas about morality, success, and the role of women. Today, we read these same scenes very differently. One reason my experience with the novel was a little unusual is the edition I happened to read. For decades, most readers weren't actually reading exactly the text Dreiser originally wrote. In the early 1980s, scholars restored tens of thousands of words that had been edited before publication. Penguin released that restored edition as its original text edition. That's the version I happened to read. Today, if you buy the Penguin Classics edition, you're essentially getting that same restored text. I think that's a fascinating piece of literary history. I'm definitely overdue for a reread. In fact, being here in Chicago has moved it much higher on my reading list. I'd like to experience the novel again, this time when I can actually picture the city Dreiser was writing about. And while we're talking about Theodore Dreiser, I have to mention another of his novels, An American Tragedy, not set in Chicago. It's a big book. It's over 800 pages in many editions, but I found it absolutely riveting. It's one of those novels that never feels as long as it looks. One day, I'd also like to read Dreiser's trilogy of desire: The Financier, The Titan, and The Stoic. Dreiser helped establish Chicago as a literary city. Just a few years later, another writer would expose a very different side of that growing metropolis: its factories, its stockyards, and the lives of the immigrant workers who kept them running. That brings us to Upton Sinclair and The Jungle. The next stop on our literary tour of Chicago takes us to the stockyards. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. For many readers, it's the novel that exposed the horrifying conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking industry. The public reaction was enormous. In fact, the novel helped inspire reforms in food inspection and food safety. But Sinclair Lewis himself was disappointed by that reaction. He famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." What he really wanted to write about wasn't food. It was people. Through the story of Jurgis Rudkis and his Lithuanian immigrant family, Sinclair shows the crushing realities of industrial capitalism. Chicago is the land of opportunity, until it isn't. Dreams collide with poverty. Hard work isn't always enough, and the system itself often seems designed to grind people down. I listened to The Jungle on audiobook sometime in the late 90s. I was in my early 30s, and I have to admit, I completely missed Sinclair's main point. At the time, I was much more politically conservative than I am today. Like so many readers before me, I came away thinking primarily about the meatpacking industry, the conditions, the sanitation, the food. Meanwhile, Sinclair's deeper concern, the lives of immigrant workers and the human cost of industrialization, it went right over my head. That's the folly of youth. Sometimes we just don't reread books. Books reread us. We come back to them with different experiences, different assumptions, and different questions. I suspect that if I picked up The Jungle today, I'd have a very different conversation with it than I did 30 years ago. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy rereading books. Sometimes the book hasn't changed. The reader has. If Dreiser introduced us to a Chicago as a city of ambition, Chicago showed us the human cost of building an industrial giant. By 1940, another Chicago had emerged, a city divided by race, a city whose pressures would shape one of the most unforgettable characters in American literature. That brings us to Richard Wright and Native Son. By 1940, Chicago had become a very different city. Richard Wright's Native Son remains one of the most powerful and controversial American novels ever written. It tells the story of Bigger Thomas, a young black man whose life is shaped by segregation, poverty, fear, and systematic racism. This isn't an easy novel. It isn't meant to be. Wright forces us to confront uncomfortable questions instead of offering us comforting answers. Chicago isn't simply where the story takes place. It becomes one of the forces acting upon every decision Bigger makes. Bigger murders a white girl, accidentally, but deliberately attempts a cover-up that spirals out of control. I first read Native Son in the mid-1980s, not long after finishing college. I grew up as a white kid in the suburbs. My life couldn't have been more different from Bigger Thomas's, and yet I could feel the walls closing in around him. That, to me, is one of the marks of a great novel. It allows us to experience a life completely unlike our own, even if we can never fully understand that experience. We can begin to feel its emotional reality. That's what Wright accomplishes. I think Native Son is one of the greatest novels ever written by an American, not because it's comfortable, quite the opposite, because it refuses to let us look away. There's another aspect of the novel that's worth mentioning. When Wright wrote Native Son, he was deeply involved with the Communist Party. For a young black writer during the Great Depression, the party was one of the few organizations actively fighting against segregation, supporting black workers, and speaking out against lynching. That history matters. But I don't think Native Son should be read simply as communist literature. It's much richer than that. Wright argues that Bigger Thomas isn't simply the product of his own choices. He's also the product of a society that created him. That idea reaches its fullest expression near the end of the novel in the speeches by Bigger's lawyer, Boris Max. Many readers have assumed Max speaks directly for Wright. I think the truth is more complicated. Wright gives us Max some of the novel's biggest ideas, but Bigger Thomas remains stubbornly himself. He can never be reduced to a political theory. Ironically, even as Native Son was becoming a literary sensation, Wright was losing faith in the Communist Party. He grew frustrated with its ideological rigidity, its eternal politics, and its attempt to tell writers what they should write. By the early 1940s, he had effectively broken away. That evolution becomes fascinating when you read another one of his novels, The Outsider. Instead of asking, how does society create a man like Bigger Thomas, Wright begins to ask a different question. Can any political system, any philosophy, or any ideology fully explain what it means to be human? The novel is deeply influenced by existential thinkers like Sartre and Camus. It's less interested in politics and more interested in freedom, responsibility, and isolation. Many critics expected Wright to write another Native Son. Instead, he surprised them. Personally, I think Native Son is one of the masterpieces of American literature. The Outsider is more of a curiosity, not because it isn't ambitious, it certainly is, but because it shows a writer wrestling with an entirely different question. Taken together, the two novels remind us that great writers continue to grow. Their ideas change, their philosophies evolve, and sometimes that's just as interesting as the novels themselves. If Wright revealed Chicago's racial divisions, the next writer turned his attention to another part of the city, its taverns, its alleys, its rooming houses, and the forgotten people living in the shadows. Well, that brings us to Nelson Algren and the Man with the Golden Arm. If Richard Wright showed us one side of Chicago, Nelson Algren showed us another. The Man with the Golden Arm was published in 1949. Its central character is Frankie Machine, a card dealer, a morphine addict, and a veteran trying to rebuild his life after World War II. This isn't the Chicago of postcards or skyscrapers. It's the Chicago of taverns, back alleys, cheap apartments, pool halls, and people living one bad decision away from disaster. I first listened to The Man with the Golden Arm in 2017. A few years later, I reread it as an ebook. I have to admit, I'm drawn to stories about outsiders, misfits, people who don't quite fit in to the world around them. Frankie Machine certainly fits that description. He's not an especially good man. He's not always a likable man. But Algren makes his struggles feel deeply human. I found myself caring about him, even when he made one terrible decision after another. Nelson Algren became almost inseparable from the city he wrote about. Although he was born in Detroit, his family moved to Chicago when he was very young. Nearly all his important fiction is rooted in the city's working class neighborhoods. He wasn't interested in Chicago's wealthy businessmen, or famous architecture, or glamorous nightlife. He wrote about gamblers, bartenders, factory workers, Small-time thieves, addicts, people most writers simply ignored. And yet, he never looked down on them. He gave them the dignity that literature often reserves for heroes. Walking through Lincoln Park over the last few days, it's been hard not to wonder who Algren would have been writing about if he were still alive. One of the more fascinating chapters in Algren's life was his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir. They met here in Chicago in 1947 and carried on a remarkable love affair for years. She wanted him to move permanently to Paris. He refused, partly because he simply couldn't imagine living anywhere else except Chicago. I think that tells you almost everything you need to know about Nelson Algren. Chicago wasn't just where he lived, it was part of who he was. The Man with the Golden Arm became the very first winner of the National Book Award for Fiction in 1950. Today, he's still best known for this novel, although many readers also recommend Never Come Morning and A Walk on the Wild Side. I've already picked up a copy of Never Come Morning while I've been here in Chicago. So I have a feeling Algren and I aren't finished with each other yet. If Algren showed us the people living in Chicago's shadows, the next writer showed us something entirely different. Its restless energy, its optimism, its endless possibilities. That brings us to Saul Bellow and the adventures of Augie March. If Algren gave us Chicago's forgotten people, Saul Bellow gave us its restless imagination. The Adventures of Augie March begins with one of the most famous opening lines in American literature. I am an American, Chicago born. It's a wonderful opening, confident, energetic, optimistic, and in many ways, it captures the spirit of the entire novel. Unlike many Chicago novels that focus on hardship or injustice, Augie March bursts with possibility. It's funny, ambitious, philosophical, and filled with unforgettable characters. Chicago isn't simply this setting. It's the force that convinces one young man that almost anything might be possible, even if he never quite figures out what he wants to do with that freedom. I listened to the audiobook back in 2009. To be honest, it didn't make a particularly strong impression upon me. At the time, I'd never visited Chicago. Looking back, I think I missed something important. This is a novel deeply rooted in the city itself. Now that I've spent some time walking those streets, visiting bookstores, riding the L, and simply watching Chicago go about its day, I'm eager to return to it. In fact, while I've been here, I picked up a Penguin Classics edition for exactly that reason. Some books arrive at exactly the right time. Others ask us to come back later. I think Augie March has been patiently waiting for me. Saul Bellow was born in Canada to Russian Jewish immigrants. His family moved to Chicago when he was a boy. He grew up in neighborhoods like Humboldt Park and Rogers Park, places that helped shape his imagination. By the time he received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1976, he had become one of the most celebrated American novelists of the 20th century. What I admire most about Bellow is the way he sees Chicago. not primarily as a city of tragedy or corruption or despair, but as a place overflowing with ideas, ambition, immigrants, eccentrics, and the possibility. If Algren looked into Chicago's alley, Bellow looked towards its horizon. Both saw the same city. They simply saw different truths. What brings us to the final novel on today's list. It is the only one I haven't finished, the one that defeated me the first time, and perhaps the one I'm most excited to return to, Leon Forrest's Divine Days. We finally arrived at the last novel on today's list, and in some ways, it's the one I most wanted to talk about, Leon Forrest's Divine Days. If you've never heard of Leon Forrest, you're not alone. He's one of those remarkable American writers whose reputation among writers and scholars is much greater than it is among the general reading public. Forrest was born and raised on Chicago's South Side. Unlike many writers who eventually left, he remained deeply connected to the city throughout his life. The South Side wasn't simply where he lived. It became the imaginative center of nearly all his fiction. Divine Days was published in 1992, and I think it's one of the most ambitious American novels of the last 50 years. This isn't an easy book. It's long, it's demanding, it's filled with overlapping voices, family histories, music, religion, memory, and the rich cultural life of Black Chicago. Reading it sometimes feels less like following a plot and more like listening to a great jazz musician improvise. Themes appear, disappear, and return again in unexpected ways. Many people have called Divine Days Chicago's Ulysses. I understand the comparison, not because Leon Forrest was trying to imitate James Joyce, but because both writers attempted something extraordinary. Joyce wanted to capture the soul of Dublin. Forrest wanted to capture the soul of Black Chicago, not just its streets, but its memories, its voices, its history, its spiritual life. I should confess something. Years before I joined BookTube, I'd made it about 200 pages into Divine Days before I finally admitted to myself, I wasn't ready. At the time, I'd already read Ulysses. I'd already read The Sound and the Fury, and I'd already read Gravity's Rainbow. But I was still reading mostly on my own. Since then, something has changed. It's not just the books I've read, it's the conversations I've had about them. BookTube, reading groups, and discussing difficult novels with other readers have made me a better reader. They've taught me to slow down, to be patient, to accept uncertainty, and to enjoy the journey instead of worrying about reaching the finishing line. I've often said that you never step into the same book twice. The book hasn't changed, the reader has. Since then, I've also read J.R., The Magic Mountain, and many other demanding novels, not because they become easy, but because I've become more comfortable living with difficult books. Now, I find myself thinking about Divine Days again, not because I expect it to be easier, but because I think I'm finally ready to meet it on its own terms. One of the endearing mysteries of American literature is why Leon Forrest isn't better known. My guess is that his novels simply ask more of the reader than most people are willing to give, but difficult novels have always found their readers. Maybe they just need a little more time. As I was preparing for this trip, I discovered that Divine Days had recently been brought back into print. I took that as a sign, not that I should rush into it, but that perhaps its time has come again. For me, and maybe for other readers as well. I don't think I will get to Divine Days in 2026. My reading schedule is already full. But 2027, that's another story. So let me ask you a question. Would anyone be interested in a group read of Divine Days in 2027? If that's something you'd seriously consider, let me know in the comments. I have a feeling this remarkable novel deserves far more readers than it's had. Of course, 6 novels barely scratch the surface of Chicago literature. Before we finish, let me mention a few more books that belong on your radar. Before we wrap up, I should mention that these 6 novels barely scratch the surface of Chicago literature. If you enjoy Saul Bellow, I can also suggest Humboldt's Gift and the Dean's December. Richard Wright's Laud Today is worth seeking out as well. James T. Farrell's Studs Lonergan trilogy remains one of the great portraits of Irish-American Chicago. Sandra Cisneros' The House on Mango Street offers a very different but equally memorable vision of the city. And if you enjoy short fiction, I can suggest Stuart Debic's The Cost of Chicago. I'm sure I've left out some of your favorites. If I have, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Looking out over Chicago, I realized something. There isn't one Chicago. There are many Chicagos. The Chicago Theodore Dreiser saw isn't quite the Chicago of Upton Sinclair. Sinclair's city isn't Richard Wright's. Richard Wright's isn't Nelson Algren's. Algren's isn't Saul Bellow's, and Bellow's isn't Leon Forrest. They're all writing about the same city, but each of them discovered a different truth. Dreiser wrote about ambition and the consequences of desire. Sinclair showed us the human costs of industrial progress. Wright exposed the city's racial divisions and the forces that shaped Bigger Thomas. Algren insisted the forgotten people living in Chicago's shadows deserved the same dignity as everyone else. Bellow celebrated the city's energy and its imagination and its endless possibilities. And Forrest revealed the spiritual, cultural, and historical richness of Black Chicago. Put these 6 authors together and you begin to understand why Chicago belongs alongside New York, Paris, London, and Dublin as one of the world's great literary cities. Look over the skyline. I visited Chicago before, but this trip has been different. This time I've been seeing the city through books, and I have a feeling the next time I reread Sister Carrie, Augie March, or finally finish Divine Days, I'll be seeing them differently. I've stood here, and that's one of the great pleasures of reading. Books change the way we see places, and places change the way we read books. If you've never read one of these novels, or if you think I've overlooked an essential Chicago book, I generally love to hear your thoughts and recommendations. And if you're interested in tackling Divine Days together in 2027, let me know that as well. I'd love to make that happen. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep on reading.